Sometimes the truth hits when you least expect it. Mine showed up at our front door on a Wednesday afternoon, wrapped in an oversized delivery box. I'd been home early that day, planning to spend a little extra time with the kids. Sarah was supposed to be at work. But here she was, practically racing up the driveway the moment the delivery truck pulled away, eyes wide, fingers clenching her car keys. "What's in the box?" I asked, genuinely curious. She froze for a split second, just long enough for the gears to start turning in my mind. Sarah's not the type to forget things, meticulous, almost annoyingly so. If she'd ordered something, I would have known about it. "Oh, nothing, just some work stuff," she said, flashing a smile that seemed a little too forced, a little too bright. "Work stuff?" I echoed, already feeling a strange mix of confusion and suspicion. Since when does work stuff come in a box big enough to hold a small child? Her laugh sounded brittle, like glass cracking under pressure. "It's just brochures and signs," she stammered. "For a new listing." But even as she tried to dismiss it, she darted forward, grabbing the box before I could reach it. The box looked hefty, too heavy for her to carry alone, but she gave it a determined yank, heading toward the garage. "Need some help?" I asked, already moving to follow her. "No." Her reply was a little too quick, a little too sharp. She paused, took a deep breath, then added, I got it, Jake. Go play with the kids. I'll be right in." She wasn't right in. 10 minutes turned to 20, then 30, and she was still in the garage. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I cracked open the door to the garage as quietly as I could, peering in. There was Sarah, crouched down next to the box, sorting through what looked like paperwork. But she was moving frantically, stuffing some papers into a folder, shoving others back into the box. And she looked panicked. I was still trying to process the scene when she looked up and saw me. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Guilt, maybe. Fear. Something dark. She tried to cover it up with a smile, but I could see right through it. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Didn't you hear me? I told you I'd be in soon." But her voice gave her away, as did the shaky hands she tried to hide behind her back. I felt the familiar twist of suspicion harden into something sharper, more insistent. Whatever was in that box, it wasn't just work stuff. I didn't know it yet, but that delivery box was about to turn my entire life upside down. For the rest of that day, Sarah acted like everything was fine. She was cheerful, almost too cheerful, chattering about her day and putting extra attention into dinner. She floated around the kitchen, asking me if I wanted more mashed potatoes, if the steak was cooked the way I liked it, if I wanted to sit down with a glass of wine after the kids were in bed. I tried to play along, forcing a smile, but the whole time, I couldn't shake the image of her crouched over that box, stuffing papers into folders like her life depended on it. When she went upstairs to put the kids to bed, I saw my chance. I slipped out to the garage, already mentally preparing my excuse if she caught me. Maybe I'd say I needed a wrench, or I was looking for that bag of rock salt we kept in the corner. But as I stepped into the garage, I didn't need to search for the box, she'd left it right in the open. If I hadn't been suspicious, I'd have assumed she'd just forgot about it. But she'd never been careless with anything, let alone something that had put her on edge the way that box had. I knelt down and lifted the lid. At first, it did look like ordinary work stuff, brochures, a stack of business cards, some empty folders, even a couple of those cheap promotional pens she was always leaving in her car. But something still didn't sit right. The box was packed too haphazardly, with some papers crumpled and others tossed in randomly, which wasn't like her at all. And then, tucked beneath the pile of papers, I saw it, a thin black leather-bound book, the kind you'd pick up in an office supply store, the kind she never used. Sarah was a digital calendar person, always had been. I opened it, thumbing through a few pages, expecting to see something harmless, maybe notes for a client. But the first page alone stopped me cold. In her neat handwriting, she'd written, May 3rd, dinner at 8 p.m. The name James was scrawled next to it. I flipped to another page. June 12th, meet after work. Hotel by the river. I flipped through more and more pages, and it was the same story. She'd written the dates, the times, sometimes even the places. One after another, there were notes about meetings, all marked with a single name, James. And these weren't work meetings. That much was clear. It took me a second to realize my hands were shaking. I felt my heartbeat hammering in my ears, a slow, angry thud that drowned out everything else. I closed the book and just sat there, breathing slowly, letting it sink in. Sarah was cheating on me. I'd heard people talk about seeing red, but I didn't feel angry, at least not yet. It was more like someone had just stripped everything away from me in one quick, silent pull. My marriage, my family, my sense of what was real and what wasn't, it was all gone, just like that. I closed the box, stood up, and went back inside, putting the book exactly where I'd found it. She wouldn't know that I'd seen it. Not yet. When I got back to the kitchen, Sarah was coming down the stairs, that bright smile still plastered on her face. She asked if I wanted to open a bottle of wine, maybe watch a movie. I barely heard her, I just nodded, going through the motions, all while my mind raced. All I could think about was every moment, every excuse, every late night she'd ever brushed off as work. I'd taken her word without question, like a fool. We sat in silence for a while. She talked a little, mostly just light conversation, nothing worth remembering. I watched her carefully, half expecting her to crack under my stare, but she didn't. She just went on, oblivious to the storm she'd just unleashed in my mind. Finally, she turned in early, claiming she had an early showing the next morning. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, like it was nothing, like we weren't on the brink of something explosive. I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, every nerve in my body tense and ready to snap. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that stupid black book with James written on every page, like a taunt, like a sick reminder of how easily she'd played me. I didn't know what to do, not yet. I needed to keep my cool, keep her unaware that I knew. The last thing I wanted was for her to cover her tracks or lie her way out of it. The next morning, I left the house early, telling her I needed to get some extra hours in at the office. But instead of going to work, I sat in my car, scrolling through every shared bank statement, every line on her credit card bills, any clue that could lead me to the truth. At first, it looked innocent enough: gas stations, grocery stores, the usual expenses. But then I spotted it, an odd charge from a few weeks ago, a $400 dinner at a restaurant I'd never heard of, one she'd definitely never mentioned to me. I drove straight there. It was a high-end place downtown, the kind of place you'd take someone to impress them, the kind of place that would drain half my paycheck for one night out. And she'd never mentioned it, not once. When I got there, I asked the hostess if I could speak to the manager. I had a story ready, about a lost credit card, but as soon as I asked if they had any record of her reservation, I felt ridiculous. This wasn't how people did things. I was sure they'd kick me out, or tell me they couldn't give out that kind of information. But instead, the manager just nodded, went to check the records, and came back, confirming that she had, in fact, dined there a few weeks ago with one other guest. I didn't need to ask who. I already knew. When I got back home, I went through every other charge on her card, every purchase she'd ever made over the last 6 months. The hotel receipts, the extra meals, everything she thought she'd hidden, all of it was right there in plain sight. I could see every move she'd made, every time she'd slipped away to be with him. I even found a second phone bill under her name, something she'd been paying off slowly, probably assuming I'd never think to look for it. By the time I'd finished, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The Sarah I'd married didn't exist. The woman I'd built a life with, trusted with everything I had, was a lie. I wanted to confront her right then, throw the evidence in her face, demand an explanation. But a part of me held back, calculating, making a plan. I knew now that she was lying, but I wanted her to admit it herself. To see that look on her face, that moment when she'd realize I knew everything. That night, I played along like nothing had changed. She asked me about work, I asked her about her plans for the weekend, and we talked about the kids. The whole time, I studied her face, looking for any hint, any flicker of guilt or regret. But she was good, too good. If I didn't know better, I'd have thought she was telling the truth. The next day, I started tracking her. It was easier than I expected. She barely noticed me checking her phone now and then, jotting down addresses. And every time she said she'd be working late or had an appointment, I'd drive by, just to see. More often than not, she'd be there, meeting James somewhere out of the way, always careful, always pretending like she was just another professional woman going about her day. The final straw came on a Tuesday, about a week after I'd found the black book. She told me she'd be showing a property in a neighboring town, and she'd be late, so I shouldn't wait up for her. I nodded, kissed her goodbye, and watched her drive away. Then I followed, careful to keep my distance, making sure she wouldn't spot me. She didn't go to any property. She went straight to a hotel just outside town, where she met up with him. I waited for an hour, 2 hours, until she finally came out, hair tousled, shirt untucked, looking like a woman who'd spent her afternoon anywhere but at work. When she got home that night, she found me waiting in the living room. I'd pulled out every piece of evidence I'd gathered, the receipts, the phone bill, even a photo I'd taken of her leaving the hotel. And I knew, as soon as she looked at me, that she realized it was over. "Sarah," I said quietly, holding up one of the receipts. "Do you want to tell me what's really been going on?" I thought I was prepared for this. I'd built up a wall of cold anger and frustration, rehearsed what I would say, the questions I would ask, and the accusations I'd lay out. But when Sarah walked in and saw the evidence stacked in neat, damning piles on our coffee table, all of that went out the window. She froze, the front door still slightly open, her keys dangling loosely in one hand as her eyes flicked from the receipts to my face, then back to the receipts. I watched her, searching for a reaction. Guilt? Shock? Maybe some hint of regret? Instead, there was nothing. She took a breath, shut the door, and carefully placed her purse on the side table. She straightened her coat, folding it over her arm as if she were walking into a business meeting. It was like she'd flicked a switch, slipping into the role of the calm, controlled professional she used with her clients. "Do you want to explain this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She sat down slowly, her face impassive, and placed her folded hands on her lap. She looked me in the eye for a moment before dropping her gaze, finally landing on the receipts. "What exactly do you think you found, Jake?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a calculated softness in her tone, like she was testing the waters, seeing how much I knew. "What I've found," I repeated, almost laughing at how composed she was trying to be. "Let's start with the basics. I found your little black book out in the garage. All the times, the dates, the meetings, the hotel addresses. Everything, Sarah. I found everything." Her eyes widened slightly, just for a second, then narrowed again as she seemed to gather herself. "You went through my things?" she asked, as if that was the only crime committed here. I leaned forward, hands gripping my knees to keep myself from exploding. "You're seriously going to play the invasion of privacy card right now? After what I found? After what you've been doing?" She opened her mouth to respond but closed it just as quickly, clearly deciding not to waste time trying to deflect. A beat passed before she sighed, a deep, drawn-out sigh like she'd just been handed a particularly inconvenient problem to deal with. She leaned back and crossed her arms, looking me squarely in the eye. "Fine," she said. "I've been seeing someone. I don't think I have to spell out the details for you." The calm in her voice, the lack of remorse, set something off in me. I could feel my patience snapping, the words pouring out before I could stop them. "How long has this been going on, Sarah?" My voice was sharp, each word cutting through the silence. "How long have you been sneaking around behind my back? Lying to me, lying to the kids, lying to everyone?" She shifted uncomfortably, crossing her legs and looking away for a moment before meeting my gaze again. 6 months, she admitted, her voice steady. "It's been about 6 months. 6 months?" I repeated, feeling the weight of it settle on me. Half a year of her smiling at me, telling me she loved me, playing the perfect wife. It felt sick, twisted. Like everything in my life had been scripted by someone else. "Yes, 6 months," she replied, her tone almost defiant now. "And before you say anything, Jake, I don't expect you to understand. I don't even know if I understand it myself." "Understand?" I shot back, my voice rising. "Understand what, exactly?" That you'd rather spend your time in hotel rooms with a stranger than here, with your family? That you lied to my face every single day for 6 months? How could you? She held up a hand, stopping me mid-sentence. It's not that simple, she said, her voice clipped, like she was correcting a child. Nothing is ever that simple. I leaned back, crossing my arms, daring her to continue. All right, then. Make me understand. Explain to me what was so complicated about this that you couldn't just tell me. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty straightforward. She paused, biting her lip, her hands wringing in her lap. For a moment, I thought she might break, might actually show some emotion. But when she spoke, her voice was cold, clinical. Look, Jake, things haven't been good between us for a while now, she began, her tone almost detached. You've been so wrapped up in your job, in the routine, that we stopped being us a long time ago. I don't even know who we are anymore. Oh, don't give me that, I interrupted, unable to keep the anger from spilling over. I've been wrapped up in work? I've been keeping us afloat, Sarah. I've been doing everything I can to support this family while you were off playing house with someone else. You don't get it, she snapped, her composure finally cracking. This isn't about you working. It's about us drifting apart. We're roommates, Jake. That's what we've become. I don't know how to talk to you anymore, how to connect with you. It's like you don't even see me. Don't see you? I laughed bitterly, the absurdity of it almost too much to handle. What, so this was about attention? You didn't feel seen, so you decided the best way to fix that was to run off and find someone else? She shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable, but she didn't deny it. I needed something, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. I needed to feel something again, Jake. I was drowning here. Drowning? I repeated, incredulous. You were drowning, so you thought it would be a good idea to cheat on me? To break our family apart? To put our kids through this? Her face tightened, and I could see the anger flashing in her eyes. This isn't just about you, Jake. I needed more than what we had. And if you're honest with yourself, maybe you'll realize that you haven't exactly been there for me either. It took everything in me not to shout, to keep my voice level. And what about the kids, Sarah? Did you think about them while you were off finding yourself in some cheap hotel? Or were they just collateral damage in all of this? Her jaw clenched, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I didn't plan for this to happen, she muttered. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't feel like myself anymore. And he made me feel alive. Alive? The word hit me like a punch. And what about me, Sarah? What about all the years we spent together, everything we built, everything we worked for? That didn't make you feel alive? She looked down, and for the first time, I saw something that resembled shame cross her face. I know I've hurt you, Jake. I know this isn't something I can just explain away. But I don't regret it. Those last words, I don't regret it, were like nails in a coffin. There it was, her final admission, plain and unvarnished. She didn't regret a second of it. I felt a cold wave wash over me, a kind of calm that I'd only felt once before, when I lost my father. It was the calm that comes when you know something is truly, irrevocably over. All right, I said, standing up, my voice almost eerily calm. Then I think we're done here, Sarah. You don't regret it? Fine. But don't expect me to stay here and pretend like any of this can be fixed. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but the words died on her lips. She knew as well as I did that there was no going back from this. I saw it in her face, that quiet acceptance, that look of resignation. I'll be staying with a friend tonight, I continued, grabbing my keys off the table. I'll be back tomorrow for my things. As I turned to leave, she reached out, her hand brushing my arm. Jake, please. Just don't do anything drastic. Let's talk about this tomorrow. Maybe we can. I don't know, try counseling or something. I looked down at her hand, then back at her face, and I could see the faint glimmer of desperation in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally realizing what she was about to lose. But it was too late. Counseling? I repeated, shaking my head. You should have thought about that 6 months ago. Before you threw our life away for someone else. With that, I pulled away from her grasp and walked out the door, leaving her sitting there in the living room, alone. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I drove aimlessly for a while that night, letting the emptiness of the road swallow me up. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, Sarah's name lighting up the screen. Ignored it. Every buzz was just a fresh reminder of how she'd torn apart everything we'd built. Eventually, I pulled over to the side of the road, just sitting in silence, staring out into the night, trying to make sense of everything. I thought about the years I'd spent trusting her, the sacrifices, the times I'd worked myself to exhaustion so she could keep her career flexible, so we could build a life that was stable, predictable. And all along, she'd been lying to me. Maybe I'd have been able to live with her excuses, maybe even with her "I don't regret it" speech. But her calmness, her nerve to act like I was some clueless fool who could just roll over and take it, well, that was something I couldn't let slide. Around midnight, I found myself parked outside my buddy Tom's place. Tom had been my best friend since college. He was one of the few people I knew I could trust with something like this. I knocked on his door, and he answered in a faded t-shirt, hair rumpled, looking half asleep but alert the second he saw my face. I didn't even have to say much, one look at me, and he already knew something was wrong. "Sarah?" he asked quietly, and I just nodded. He let me in without another word. I told him everything, right down to her confession in our living room. He listened without interrupting, just sat there with his arms crossed, his expression shifting from shock to anger. When I was done, he let out a long, low whistle. "Man. I don't know what to say. That's messed up, Jake. Really messed up." I didn't reply, I was done talking. I didn't need sympathy. What I needed was a way to hit back, a way to make her understand what she destroyed. Tom got it without me having to say it. He stood up, pacing back and forth, thinking things over. Then he grinned a wicked, satisfied grin. "So, what do you want to do?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of challenge. "You want to fight back?" For the first time that night, I felt something other than anger or pain. I felt a grim sense of purpose. I didn't need to get even just to satisfy my own rage. I needed to show Sarah that this wasn't just another mistake she could brush off. She needed to feel the weight of her choices. First things first, I needed to get my assets lined up. Over the years, I'd saved every penny I could, building up a retirement fund and a few accounts we never touched except in emergencies. She knew about some of them but hadn't paid much attention. By the next morning, I was on the phone with my bank, moving every single dollar out of our shared account and into a private one in my name. I wasn't leaving her a dime to use as leverage, and I'd be damned if I let her walk away with my hard-earned savings. I didn't stop there. That afternoon, I started changing passwords on everything. Our home security system, streaming services, my email, and every app connected to my finances. By the time I was done, there was nothing left she could access without me. I could almost picture her confusion when she'd try logging in, only to find herself locked out. That was just the start. The next part of the plan was more satisfying. Sarah might have loved the drama of sneaking around with her someone else, but she'd also banked on keeping that secret neatly tucked away from our world. She was always the type to keep up appearances, always worried about her image, about what the neighbors or her colleagues thought. It was time to rip that facade right off. I went through every bit of evidence I'd collected, the hotel receipts, the second phone bill, her own black book of dates, times, and addresses, and made sure I had it all in order. Then I compiled it into a nice little packet, complete with a detailed timeline of her affair. I printed a dozen copies and had them bound, neat and professional, the way she'd always preferred her paperwork. I decided on a Friday evening for my delivery, just when she'd be home, probably trying to salvage whatever was left of her image. I dropped the packets off with a short, handwritten note inside each one, "Thought you should know who the real Sarah is." Then, I headed to the post office and had them sent to her parents, her closest friends, a few of her colleagues, and the HR department at her office. I wanted her to know that no matter where she turned, someone would be looking at her, judging her for what she'd done. And I wasn't stopping there. It was time for a direct hit, one she wouldn't see coming. I called her boss and asked if we could meet for coffee, just a quick chat about a family matter. I kept it calm, made it sound like nothing urgent. He was happy to meet, clearly intrigued. When we sat down, I told him everything. I didn't leave out a single detail. I told him about the affair, the times and places, even the fact that she'd used company hours to cover up her meetings. I watched as his expression turned from surprise to discomfort to disgust. "You don't owe me anything," I told him, keeping my voice steady. "But I thought you should know what's been happening under your nose." He thanked me, barely looking me in the eye, and I left him there, staring down at his coffee, knowing he'd be dealing with the fallout on his end soon enough. When I got home that evening, Sarah was waiting in the driveway, her face pale, her eyes red and puffy. I didn't need to ask, she must have found out about the packets, maybe even heard from her boss by now. She rushed toward me, grabbing my arm, pleading. "Jake, please, we need to talk. This has gone too far." I pulled my arm free, keeping my voice low and controlled. "You wanted to keep it a secret, didn't you? Pretend like none of this would ever come back to bite you. Guess what, Sarah? Secrets have a way of coming out." Her face crumpled, and I saw a flash of genuine fear in her eyes. She wasn't crying for me or for the life we'd built. No, she was crying for herself, for the mess she'd made, for the way her carefully curated life was crumbling around her. It was almost satisfying, watching her panic, knowing that every single comfort she'd taken for granted was being stripped away. I made a mistake," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I hurt you, Jake. But I never thought you'd do this. I never thought you'd hurt you back?" I finished for her, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. "Well, now you know exactly how it feels." She shook her head, wiping away a tear with the back of her hand. "You don't understand. This isn't just about us anymore. You've gone too far. You've involved everyone, my parents, my friends, even my job." "Too far?" I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. "No, Sarah. You went too far when you decided to throw everything away for some fling. Don't act like I'm the bad guy here." Her face twisted, and I saw the flash of defiance return, that streak of pride that had always kept her from taking full responsibility. "You think this is going to make you feel better, Jake? Ruining me? Destroying everything?" "No," I replied, my voice firm. "But it's going to make sure you can't just walk away and pretend like none of this happened. You don't get to do that, Sarah. Not this time." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, alone in the driveway, her anger and desperation mixing with the night air. The next day, I gathered the last of my things, packing up the memories and fragments of a life that, in the end, had been a lie. As I looked around the house one last time, I didn't feel regret or nostalgia, just a cold, hard satisfaction that I'd shown her what it felt like to lose everything. I knew I wouldn't be going back, not to her, not to this life. And as I drove away, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Leaving her there, crumbling, had given me a sense of closure, or so I thought. But closure doesn't always work the way you hope it will. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the images from my mind, her face, shocked and pleading, her hands clutching the edge of the driveway as I walked away. Even though I'd watched her life fall apart in real time, there was a nagging, hollow feeling left behind. About a week later, Sarah called me. I'd ignored her calls, blocked her on social media, and hadn't responded to any messages. She left voicemails every night, her voice breaking as she begged me to meet one last time for closure. I'd had enough of her closure, but part of me wanted to hear what she had left to say, if only to see if she'd finally take responsibility. We agreed to meet at a diner we used to go to when we were first dating, a place where we'd once spent hours laughing over coffee and sharing stories. It felt surreal walking in, like stepping back into a life that didn't exist anymore. She was already seated in the corner, hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes fixed on the cup of coffee in front of her. She looked exhausted, hair pulled back messily, shadows under her eyes, a far cry from the composed woman I'd left behind in the driveway. She glanced up as I sat down, forcing a small, sad smile. Thank you for meeting me, Jake. I didn't think you'd agree to it. Neither did I replied, keeping my voice neutral. What do you want, Sarah? She flinched slightly at my tone but kept her composure. I just wanted to talk. There are things I need to say, things I should have said before all of this happened. I leaned back, crossing my arms. All right, go ahead. I'm listening. She took a deep breath, clearly trying to find the words. I know I've ruined everything. I know there's nothing I can say to make it right. But you have to understand. I didn't start out trying to hurt you, Jake. I never wanted to betray you like this. I shook my head, my patience already wearing thin. But you did, Sarah. Over and over. You had every chance to stop, every chance to come to me, to tell me what was wrong, to fix things. But you didn't. I know, she whispered, her voice cracking. I know I made the wrong choice. I was selfish. I was lost, Jake. I don't even know who I am anymore. I don't know how I got here. I watched her, feeling a pang of something I couldn't name, pity, maybe. Or regret. Or just exhaustion from hearing the same excuses over and over. And now what? What are you hoping for? She looked up, eyes red-rimmed, and for the first time, she looked genuinely vulnerable, stripped of all her usual defenses. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly. Anne. I want to try to fix this, somehow. I know it's probably impossible, but I'm willing to do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. Just, don't give up on us, Jake. Please. The desperation in her voice, the way her hands trembled as she reached for mine, caught me off guard. For a split second, I almost felt myself soften. We'd built a life together, shared years of memories, laughter, plans for the future. Part of me wanted to believe her, to forgive, to try again. But the rest of me, the part that had spent weeks drowning in anger and betrayal, knew better. Why now, Sarah? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why is it only now, after everything, that you're willing to fight for us? Where was this when you were sneaking around, when you were lying to my face? She looked down, her face crumpling as tears welled up in her eyes. I was scared, Jake. Scared of losing you, scared of facing what I'd done. I thought I could keep it hidden, that it would just go away somehow. But I was wrong. And now I've lost everything. Her admission hung in the air between us, a hollow confession that felt far too little, far too late. Yes, you have, I replied, my voice as steady as I could make it. You've lost everything. And that's on you, Sarah. She reached for my hand again, but I pulled back, not ready to give her the comfort she was seeking. Jake. I know I don't deserve it, but please. I need another chance. We could go to counseling, work on rebuilding trust. We owe it to ourselves, to the years we spent together. Her words sounded desperate, hopeful even, but I could see it for what it was, a last-ditch effort to save herself from the fallout she'd brought down on us both. I'd wanted that once, a way to work through our problems, to make things right. But now, after everything, I didn't have it in me to pretend that things could ever be okay again. We don't owe each other anything, Sarah, I said, feeling a sense of finality settle over me. I gave you everything. My trust, my love, my loyalty. And you threw it all away. I can't just forget that. I can't just pretend like none of this happened. She broke down then, her shoulders shaking as she tried to choke back sobs. I looked away, letting her cry without offering comfort. I wasn't here to make her feel better. I was here to get the last pieces of this mess in order and to finally say goodbye. After a few moments, she looked up, wiping her eyes. So, that's it, then? You're really done with us? I nodded, the finality of it settling deep in my bones. Yes, Sarah. I'm done. I don't want counseling. I don't want to rebuild anything. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. She sat in silence, staring at her hands, her face pale and drawn. For a second, I thought she might try to argue, to beg me again to reconsider. But instead, she just nodded, a quiet acceptance in her expression. "I understand," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I do love you, Jake. I always did, even if I didn't show it. And I'll regret this for the rest of my life." The words rang hollow, like a forced apology she thought would somehow make a difference. But it didn't matter anymore. I'd already made up my mind. "I'm glad you regret it," I said quietly, my tone hard. "Because I won't. I'm done living in this lie. I'm done trying to fix something that's broken beyond repair." She looked away, biting her lip, as if trying to hold back another wave of tears. But I didn't stay to see if she managed it. I'd heard everything I needed to hear. I left some cash on the table for our coffee, stood up, and walked out, leaving her sitting there alone. As I stepped outside, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't happiness, not by a long shot, but it was something close to peace. I'd said my piece, laid everything out, and now I could finally move on without any lingering doubts. Back in the car, I let out a long breath, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I drove away, knowing that whatever happened next, it was my choice. Not hers. Not anyone else's. A few days later, the divorce proceedings started. She didn't fight it. We split our assets as cleanly as we could, sold the house, and went our separate ways. She moved out of town, supposedly to stay with family while she figured out her next steps. I stayed put, taking some time off work to clear my head and figure out what my own next steps would be. It wasn't easy, not by a long shot. There were nights when I lay awake, haunted by the memories of our life together, the laughter, the small moments we'd shared. But each day, it got a little easier, a little less painful. I started focusing on the future, on building a new life for myself, one free from her lies and betrayal. In the end, it wasn't just about what she'd done to me, it was about taking back control, reclaiming the life I'd almost lost in the wreckage of our broken marriage. I still didn't know exactly what that life would look like, but one thing was certain, it would be on my terms, and no one else's. After the final meeting with Sarah, I thought things would settle into some kind of calm. I thought that after the papers were signed and the logistics ironed out, I'd finally be able to move on. But the first days afterward felt surreal, like I was watching my life happen from a distance. Even mundane things, making coffee, emptying the trash, felt strange without her around. But as the quiet of being alone settled in, so did the reality of what lay ahead. I could finally start over, with no illusions, no lies, no pretending. At first, I struggled with the usual questions anyone would have after such a betrayal. What had I missed? How had I not seen it sooner? Every memory, every interaction seemed tainted, and it was tempting to look back and try to find the moment when it all began to crumble. But I quickly realized that retracing her steps or revisiting the past would only leave me stuck in it. That was Sarah's story, not mine anymore. I took things one day at a time. At work, I immersed myself in projects, taking on extra hours. I picked up shifts I'd usually avoid, attended meetings I didn't need to be in anything to keep my mind focused forward. My colleagues didn't ask questions. Maybe they could tell I didn't want to talk about it, or maybe they'd already heard rumors about why I was throwing myself into work. Either way, it was fine by me. It was almost a relief to be seen as just Jake from IT again, not Jake and Sarah. Gradually, I started doing things for myself, small things I hadn't thought about in years. I took up running again, something I hadn't done in ages because Sarah always made it seem like a waste of time. I'd put it on hold, like a lot of other hobbies, trying to make our lives fit together as seamlessly as possible. I ran every morning now, letting the cold morning air wake me up, the physical effort emptying my mind. There was something satisfying about it, a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. The first weekend I spent entirely on my own, I remember sitting in silence, realizing just how much of my life had revolved around keeping Sarah happy, around being the husband she expected me to be. Without her, without those expectations, I felt like I was finally seeing myself for the first time. I'd been loyal, supportive, present, everything you're supposed to be as a partner. And yet, it hadn't been enough for her. But as I thought back, I realized I'd given up so much of myself in the process. I wasn't about to make that mistake again. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Tom at a local pub. He'd been a solid friend throughout everything, never pressing me for details, just being there when I needed him. He bought us a couple of beers, and we sat in our usual corner booth. We didn't talk about Sarah or the fallout from the divorce, he knew better than to bring it up. Instead, we talked about anything else: work, a project he was working on, his latest failed attempt at dating. Eventually, though, he leaned back and gave me a thoughtful look. "So, now what, man? What's next for Jake?" I shrugged, not really having an answer for him. "I guess I'm figuring it out as I go." He chuckled, raising his glass in a mock salute. "To figuring it out." Over the next few months, I kept busy, filling my days with work, new routines, and reconnecting with old friends I hadn't seen much of since Sarah came into my life. But there was still an emptiness, a space I hadn't yet learned how to fill. I realized it wasn't just about moving on from Sarah, it was about rebuilding, about finding out who I was without her. One night, I decided to take a drive out to the lake Sarah and I used to visit every summer. I hadn't been back there since the split, and part of me wondered if it would stir up bad memories. But as I sat there, watching the water, I didn't feel anger or regret. I just felt calm. The lake had always been my place, my spot for thinking things through, long before Sarah. I'd forgotten how much I missed that quiet. Sitting there, I thought about what had come of the entire ordeal, and it became clear that, despite the mess, I'd gained something too. I'd found a sense of self-worth, a determination not to compromise myself again for anyone who didn't value it. It wasn't an easy realization, and it didn't come with any grand sense of satisfaction. But it was real, and it was mine. It wasn't long after that when I got a text from Sarah. Seeing her name on my screen triggered a faint pang, but I'd expected it eventually. She'd probably seen the official records, maybe wanted to rehash things one last time. But her message wasn't anything I expected. "Jake, I'm sorry for everything. I know you've moved on, and I don't expect a response. But thank you for giving me a real chance at happiness. I couldn't see it then. I'm sorry for hurting you." I stared at the text for a long time. Part of me wanted to respond, to tell her exactly what I thought of her apology. But another part of me just felt done. There was no satisfaction to be had in revisiting the past with her. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. Her regrets were hers to deal with, not mine. Eventually, I deleted the message without replying, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders as I did. It was a small act, but it felt like closing a door I hadn't realized was still open. The next year brought changes I hadn't anticipated. I started spending more time with my family, visiting my brother and his kids, reconnecting with my parents. I realized that while I'd been consumed with keeping Sarah happy, I'd let those relationships drift. Now, I was making an effort, putting the work into connections that actually mattered. I also reconnected with an old friend from college, Emily, someone I hadn't seen in years. She'd been my study partner, someone who understood my sense of humor and shared my interest in books. We'd gone our separate ways after graduation, but when we bumped into each other one evening, it felt like no time had passed at all. We started catching up over coffee, talking about our lives, our careers, our families. It felt easy, natural, and I didn't have to pretend to be anything I wasn't. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself, no pretense, no expectations hanging over me. Emily and I grew closer, and soon enough, we were seeing each other regularly, though we were careful to keep things casual. I wasn't in a rush to jump into anything serious, and neither was she. But it was good, and I found myself looking forward to our time together. I realized then that this was the life I wanted: simple, honest, and unburdened by the lies and deceit that had poisoned my marriage with Sarah. I didn't need grand gestures or dramatic apologies, I just needed something real. Emily understood that, and for the first time since the divorce, I felt a quiet hope for the future. By the second anniversary of my divorce, I'd settled into a new routine. I'd left the house I'd shared with Sarah, moved into an apartment downtown. It was smaller, but it felt like mine, with bookshelves filled with novels I'd never had time to read, and photos from my travels, the life I'd started rebuilding. Tom came over to help me set up a few shelves, laughing at my minimal decor, and Emily came by with houseplants, claiming they'd add character. Looking around that night, I felt a sense of peace, a satisfaction that came from knowing I'd built this new life from the ground up. I wasn't the same person who'd walked out on Sarah that night. I was stronger, more self-assured, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself. It was a quiet transformation, one without fanfare or applause, but it was the most important change I'd ever made. I'd gone through something painful, something that could have broken me, but instead, I'd rebuilt from the ashes, finding a strength and resilience I hadn't known I had. I didn't know what the future held, but that was okay. For once, I wasn't looking to someone else to define my happiness. I was in control of my own life, my own choices. And as I sat there, surrounded by the things I'd chosen for myself, I knew I'd finally found what I'd been searching for all along. I had found freedom. And I wasn't about to give it up.